So, you've successfully overthrown a centuries-old monarchy and then a provisional government in the largest country on Earth. Congratulations! The hard part's over, right? Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks certainly seemed to think so in October 1917. They called their initial, surprisingly easy takeover the Triumphal March of Soviet Power. This is a fantastic example of naming something before you see the final product. It was less of a march and more of a stumble through a dark room, occasionally bumping into pockets of armed resistance they didn't know were there. Their first decrees were on peace and land, which sounded great to soldiers and peasants. The problem is, peace meant signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, giving away a gigantic chunk of Russia to Germany. And land meant letting peasants seize estates, which they were already doing, but now with official, albeit chaotic, approval. The Bolsheviks basically took credit for a party they didn't start, hoping everyone would just fall in line. Spoilers, they did not.
It turns out, if you seize power, cancel elections you just lost, and start telling everyone how things are going to be, some people get a little upset. This collection of the upset was called the White Movement. And calling it a movement is generous. It was more like a group project where everyone hates each other but has the same enemy. You had diehard monarchists who wanted the Tsar back, liberals who wanted a democracy, military dictators, and socialists who just thought Lenin was doing socialism wrong. Their only unifying principle was anything but the Bolsheviks, which is not a great foundation for building a new country. Then there was the Czech Legion, 40,000 well-armed Czech and Slovak soldiers who just wanted to go home, but ended up accidentally conquering the entire Trans-Siberian Railway because of a misunderstanding about a thrown iron stove. Yes, really. They became a sort of mobile, heavily armed nation rolling through Siberia, a perfect symbol for the absolute absurdity of the whole situation. They were the ultimate, I'm just trying to get to my train guys, but their train was the entire railway. Thinking it was just the Reds versus the Whites is like saying World War II was just Germany versus Britain. It's cute, but wrong. Russia became a deeply confusing rainbow of violence. You had the Greens, who were mostly peasant armies. Their political platform was stunningly simple: leave us alone. They fought the Reds when they came for their grain, and they fought the Whites when they came to restore the old landlords. Then you had the Blacks, the anarchists, led by the genuinely formidable Nestor Makhno in Ukraine. He created a functional anarchist territory, fighting off literally everyone with fast-moving cavalry and technicals, basically machine guns on horse-drawn carts. Imagine Mad Max, but with more farming communes. And let's not forget the dozens of nationalist movements who saw the empire collapsing and thought, finally, our turn. Finns, Poles, Ukrainians, Georgians, everyone was trying to carve out a country while the big players were busy strangling each other. It was less a civil war and more a battle royale free-for-all. Just when you thought it couldn't get any more complicated, the rest of the world decided to show up. The Allied intervention was one of history's most confusing and pointless military operations. American, British, French, Japanese, and a dozen other nations sent troops into Russia. Their stated goals were things like protecting Allied supply dumps and restarting the Eastern Front. Their actual activities involved sitting in port cities like Archangel and Vladivostok, occasionally getting into confusing firefights, and wondering why it was so cold. They gave tons of money and weapons to the white generals, which was a bit like giving a flamethrower to a toddler. The support was just enough to make the Bolsheviks look like brave defenders of Mother Russia against foreign invaders, but not nearly enough to actually help the whites win. The Japanese were a bit more honest. They were mostly there to grab a piece of Siberia. The whole affair was a masterclass in how to look like you're doing something important while achieving the exact opposite of your intended goal. A truly magnificent diplomatic failure. Let's zoom in on one of these white leaders, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, a man with an impressive title and a less impressive grip on reality. In 1918, with Allied backing, he was declared the supreme ruler of Russia. His government was based in Omsk, Siberia, which is a bit like declaring yourself Emperor of the United States from a desk in Omaha. Kolchak was an admiral without a fleet, governing a territory run by warlords, propped up by foreign powers he didn't trust. His biggest asset was the Imperial Gold Reserve, which the Czech Legion had kindly captured and handed over to him. He then proceeded to spend it with the financial acumen of a lottery winner on a weekend bender. He couldn't manage his own officers, let alone win the loyalty of the peasants, whom his forces treated with remarkable cruelty. His entire rule was essentially conducted from his railway carriage, a rolling symbol of his disconnect from the land he claimed to rule. Eventually, his allies got tired of him. The Czechs handed him over to his enemies in exchange for safe passage, and he was unceremoniously executed. A tragic story of supreme ruling without much actual ruling. For a brief, shining moment in 1919, it actually looked like the whites might win. General Anton Denikin, leading the armed forces of South Russia, launched a stunningly successful offensive. His army swept north, capturing vast territories and getting dangerously close to Moscow. For the Bolsheviks, this was the "oh crap" moment of the war. But Denikin's success was built on sand. His supply lines were thousands of kilometers long and managed by people who were, to put it mildly, corrupt. His officers were more interested in restoring their landed estates than in winning hearts and minds. They were notorious for their anti-Semitic pogroms, which is a spectacularly bad way to convince people your regime is an improvement. As his army advanced, it dissolved from behind, plagued by peasant uprisings, anarchist attacks, and a general lack of anyone wanting them to be in charge. They reached the city of Oryol, just 360 kilometers from Moscow, and then the whole thing just collapsed. It was the military equivalent of a magnificent souffle that deflates the second you open the oven door. The retreat was even faster than the advance. So, if the whites were so disorganized, how did the Reds win? 2 words: Leon Trotsky and his train. While the white leaders were busy squabbling in distant cities, Trotsky lived in a heavily armored train that was essentially a mobile command center for the entire Red Army. It had a printing press for propaganda, telegraph stations, its own elite troops, and, most importantly, Trotsky himself. He would race from one collapsing front to another, dispensing inspiration and summary executions in equal measure. If a Red unit retreated without orders, he would arrive, shoot the commander and the commissar, and promote some terrified but competent junior officer. It was brutal, terrifying, and unbelievably effective. He forged the Red Army from a revolutionary mob into a disciplined fighting force through sheer terror and organizational genius. The Bolsheviks had internal cohesion because the alternative was a bullet from your own side. The whites had disagreements. In a war of chaos, the side with the most centralized, ruthless control had a distinct advantage, and nobody was more ruthlessly in control than Trotsky on his death metal tour bus of a train.
Winning a war requires guns, bullets, and food. The Bolsheviks had very little of any of them. Their solution was an economic policy called war communism. This was a simple plan that involved nationalizing all industry, banning private trade, and seizing grain from peasants at gunpoint. It was supposed to be a leap into a communist utopia. In practice, it was like trying to fix a Swiss watch with a sledgehammer. Industrial production plummeted to a fraction of its pre-war levels. The cities starved because peasants, seeing no reason to grow food just to have it confiscated, grew only enough for themselves. This led to massive peasant rebellions, like the Tambov Rebellion, which the Red Army had to put down with poison gas. Yes, they used chemical weapons on their own people to secure food. It was a complete catastrophe. And yet, it worked. For the war effort, at least. The centralized control, however brutal and inefficient, allowed the Bolsheviks to funnel every last resource to the Red Army, keeping it fed and armed just enough to outlast the equally starving whites. They destroyed the economy to save the state, a choice with some rather significant long-term consequences. By 1920, the main white armies were pretty much defeated. The Bolsheviks were exhausted, but victorious. Time to rebuild, right? Wrong. Time for the Polish-Soviet War. Poland, newly independent, decided its borders weren't quite big enough and invaded Ukraine. The Bolsheviks, high on their recent victories, saw this not as a border dispute, but as an opportunity. They would beat back the Poles, march on Warsaw, and then keep going to Germany to spark a glorious European-wide revolution. Lenin was ecstatic. Trotsky was skeptical. Trotsky was right. The Red Army, after initial successes, was decisively smashed at the Battle of Warsaw in what the Poles call the Miracle on the Vistula. It turned out that Polish workers and peasants weren't thrilled about being liberated by a Russian army and fought furiously to defend their new nation. This little adventure killed the dream of exporting the revolution on the tips of bayonets and forced the Bolsheviks to accept that, for now, they were stuck governing the broken mess they had just won. The party was over, and now they had to clean up. So by 1922, the war was mostly over. The Reds had won. What exactly did they win? A country in absolute ruins. Somewhere between 7 and 12 million people were dead, mostly from starvation and disease. Industrial production was at 20% of its 1913 level. The 1921 famine, caused by years of war, grain seizure, and a drought, was one of the worst in human history, killing another 5 million people. The intellectual and professional classes were either dead, exiled, or terrified into silence. The Bolsheviks, the party that promised a workers' paradise, were now the absolute rulers of a graveyard. They had proven to be better at winning a war than anyone else, but the prize for their victory was a shattered nation and a deeply traumatized population. They achieved total power, but inherited total desolation. A stunning success by some of the most horrifying metrics imaginable. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!